Howdy, and welcome to the second lecture for the history of medicine that will meet on YouTube. And today we're going to talk about Vesalius, the great Renaissance anatomist. And I'm going to suggest that, like botany in the Renaissance, anatomy takes a major turn toward modern anatomy, if you'd like. And I think Vesalius is probably more than any figure that we've discussed in the course so far, really a revolutionary in so many ways. Not just the fact that his book is the first sort of comprehensive, detailed anatomical study, but it criticizes Galen. And actually, this is, I would argue, the second major nail in the coffin of Orthodox Galenism that occurs in this 16th century era of great skepticism in science. We're not quite at the scientific revolution yet, but in terms of anatomy, this is really the turning point. And what is interesting is I have a strange sort of fondness for Vesalius. For one, there were prints from his anatomical book in the hallway going down to the reading room where I did my dissertation research in the New York Academy of Medicine. So I used to see him every morning, his smiling face. And in fact, that's what he looks like, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I should say, good morning to Vesalius and a couple of other interesting anatomists every morning. And if you were ever in Italy, his dissection theater is still there in the University of Padua. His skeleton is in Basel, if you happen to go. So there's all sorts of very interesting things left around from Vesalius. But in any case, this is as I've said, the second thing that begins to unravel people's faith in Orthodox Galenism. And the third, which we'll talk about next time, is this strange mystic Paracelsus, who comes up with his own system that is very, very different from humoral physiology and his own chemical remedies, too. So, and these, we'll see, Paracelsus has got a lot of strange ideas in there, including magic, strangely enough, but he's still just as important. But this second breakthrough, let's say, is kind of odd. And I'm going to have to argue this thoroughly. It's odd because, in most respects, Vesalius is actually a Galenist. And I'm going to try and suggest, well, how could that be? How could he destroy Galenism and at once, follow him in many ways? He was a university professor, trained, so not someone like Leonardo, who's an outlier and drew lots of beautiful things, but really had no impact on the world. Vesalius definitely did have an impact. And the point is that he's at Padua, which is really a place where they are slavishly following the doctrines of Galen in the mid 16th century. Even, you remember, when they're cutting things open, cutting human bodies open, they will trust Galen over their own eyes. So that seems a weird place for him to emerge. But as if you've been paying attention to what I've said about Galen, if you had read Galen very closely and took his advice to heart and accepted not only his pronouncements as dogma, but accepted his approach to medicine, if you took his call for direct observation to heart, if you took his call to experiment seriously, then and of course, if you also had the same sort of bravado and showmanship that Galen had, and if you lucked out with great patrons, and what if you were also kind of quarrelsome and willing to criticize, as of course Galen was? Well, the point I'm making is that if you're a real Galenist, you're going to argue with Galen, right? That's the point. And we're not, we're not talking about the sort of ranting and raving of a crazy person like Paracelsus, who criticized everyone and made enemies because of that. Vesalius was willing to prove what he claimed in a public arena. And in this case, it's a dissection theater. What he's proving, basically, is that the ancients were wrong. That Galen, we'll see, did not have human bodies to dissect, and Vesalius is the first to show why that's the case. So it's odd, but of course, if you are, again, a real follower of Galen, he's got the seeds of his own downfall, right, into his own work. So let's talk about this guy. This is Andreas Vesalius. Despite a great deal of argument, even to this day, about the nature of his accomplishments, I think there are few historians who would doubt the claim that he's the first modern anatomist. And I'm going to have to qualify that in many, many ways. He did, of course, make mistakes himself, but and he followed even some of Galen's old mistakes made, what is it, 1300 years before. But the way he approached the topic, and most importantly, the text that he published, that he wrote and published, I think is, let's just say it, it's the single most important work in the history of medicine since Galen. I think that's fair enough. The text I'm talking about is De Humani Corporis Fabrica. If you just call it, that means the fabric of the human body. If you just call it Fabrica, that's what it's usually referred to. That comes out in 1543. It's a very interesting year, actually, for publications. It's the same year that another great revolutionary text comes out that is the kind of heralding text of the entire scientific revolution, and that's Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium. It's the book that first, of course, proposes heliocentricity through mathematical theory. They come out in the same year, which is really kind of interesting and strange. But I think Vesalius, at least in his own day, had a greater impact. Copernicus really doesn't have an impact until Galileo kind of proves what he's saying with observation and telescope. But Vesalius really did overturn things. And let me throw in a caveat here, because I'm making this comparison between these two figures, and I don't want to go too far with this. Let me point out some big differences. One, Galen wrote volumes and volumes and volumes on every single topic, that you could imagine in every field, including philosophy. Vesalius only wrote one major work, which is kind of strange. He wrote that at age 28, which is also strange, and he didn't really write anything thereafter. So it's really, he's a kind of one-hit wonder in a sense. The other major difference is, of course, Galen comes at the end of a very long, fruitful period in the history of medicine and kind of sums up everything, and then it stops dead because he's such an authority. Vesalius comes at the very beginning of a new anatomical tradition that continues, you could say, right through Gray's Anatomy and right to our own day. So Vesalius is a start, not an end point. And I think in its basics, what Vesalius was doing really is responsible for making dissection kind of the cornerstone of all medical practice, or medical education, at least to start with. But surgery, of course, obviously you need to do dissections to an anatomy to practice surgery. But I think really in any medical school in Western civilization, in Western style medicine, anatomy is, from this point on, an absolute permanent part of the curriculum, thanks to Vesalius and his followers as well. If you are a pre-med, pre-pharm, any kind of health profession, you've got to take an anatomy course, and that's basically why. It's because Vesalius puts anatomy at the center of the curriculum. Another thing that's very, very important to point out here is that although Vesalius, wrote about anatomy and does criticize Galen, he is still a Galenist in every other field. He still believes in the humors. He still, uses the kind of teleological approach to understanding physical structures that he gets from Galen, the whole idea that parts are designed with a specific purpose in mind. And I think that, another interesting contrast that I want to make between some of these revolutionary figures is Vesalius is very different from the guy I'm going to talk about next, who's Paracelsus, Paracelsus is kind of a grassroots person. He's connected to the Radical Reformation. He's thoroughly German. He hung out with thieves and miners, and was, kind of an ordinary person, let's put it that way. In contrast, Vesalius is totally a product of the Renaissance. He's a humanist, in fact. moving in elite circles, writing in an elegant Latin, Neo-Latin of the Renaissance, moving among royal courts, having very wealthy patrons. He's a man of the Renaissance, and in that respect, I think is actually spiritually more akin to Leonardo. Certainly in his thirst for knowledge and this kind of wonder at the physical structures of the human body. And in fact, I would say, in a weird way, he kind of completes what Leonardo began, especially in the field of anatomical illustration. We'll see, Vesalius wasn't a great artist, but he hired very good artists to illustrate his text. And I think, in another sense, Leonardo da Vinci and Vesalius have the same kind of wide-ranging, inquisitive, and as we'll see, very experimental minds.